Courtney Hogan will now be introducing the program and our distinguished guests.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming and joining us for the 38th Edith House Lecture. On behalf of all of the Women's Law Students Association, we want to welcome you and our guests, Justice Carla Wong McMillan and Justice Sarah Hawkins Warren from the Georgia Supreme Court. Every year, the Edith House Lecture Series brings female legal scholars and practitioners to speak at Georgia Law to honor Edith Elizabeth House. Ms. House was a native of Winder, Georgia, and she was one of the very first women to graduate from our law school. She graduated in 1925 as co-valedictorian of her class, and every year we're honored to carry on her legacy with this lecture series. Today, we're privileged to be joined by two justices of the Supreme Court. So we're going to give you just a brief introduction of them, and then we'll have a panel and conclude with a question and answer from all of our audience at the end of this. So first, Justice Carla Wong McMillan was appointed to the Supreme Court of Georgia by Governor Brian Kemp, taking office on April 10th, 2020. She was born and raised in Augusta, Georgia, and she's the first Asian Pacific American to serve on a state's highest court in all of the Southern United States. Justice McMillan completed her undergraduate degree in history and economics at Duke University, and she's an alumna of our very own University of Georgia School of Law. She attended law school as a Woodruff Scholar, and she served on the Law Review editorial board and also as president of the Christian Legal Society. After law school, Justice McMillan served as a law clerk for the Honorable William C. O'Kelly at the United States District Court for the Northern District of Georgia. She then became a partner in the litigation group of Sutherland, Asbill, and Brennan, where her practice centered on complex business litigation, including a heavy emphasis on appellate matters. Prior to her current role on the Supreme Court of Georgia, she served on the Georgia Court of Appeals and at the state court and as state court judge for Fayette County as well. Justice Sarah Hawkins Warren was appointed to the Supreme Court by Georgia Governor Nathan Deal and was sworn in on September 17, 2018. Duke is also near and dear to Justice Warren. She earned her BA there in public policy and Spanish, as well as her law degree from Duke University. While in law school, she served as the editor-in-chief of Law and Contemporary Problems and on the executive committee for the Federalist Society. After law school, Justice Warren served as a law clerk to then Chief Judge J.L. Edmondson of the United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit and to the Honorable Richard J. Leon of the United States District Court for the District of Columbia. She then spent some time in private practice as a partner at Kirkland & Ellis in Washington, D.C., before returning to her home state of Georgia in 2015. She then served in the Office of the Attorney General Sam Olens as Deputy Solicitor General and Special Counsel for Water Litigation. In January 2017, she was appointed Solicitor General by Attorney General Chris Carr, and in that role, she served as the Chief Appellate Lawyer for the entire state of Georgia and the primary advisor on constitutional law for the Attorney General. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Sarah Nelson, who will moderate our panel. And then, like I said, we're going to reserve some time at the end for question and answers. So please do feel free to ask any questions at that time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Courtney, and good morning to everybody. I'm Sarah Nelson. I'm a 3L at UGA Law, and I'm the Vice President of the Women's Law Student Association, along with Courtney. To begin today, we'd like to start with some questions about law school, since most of our audience is made up of Georgia law students. So to either justice, whichever one wants to start first, did you know what kind of law when you wanted to practice when you came to law school? And in that same vein, did you think about public service or becoming a judge while you were in school?
Justice, well, I'm happy to start, or Justice Warren.
Go ahead.
Well, I guess to give a little bit of background, I'm the first lawyer in my family, so I really didn't have much of an idea of what lawyers did other than what I saw on television. And I knew a few lawyers growing up in Augusta who were fathers of some of my friends. So I really didn't have any idea of what I wanted to do going into law school. Except I had some vague concept that international law sounds really interesting, and I know a lot of students going into law school think about that, and especially, of course, we have the Dean Rusk Center, and that new building, it was new at the time, had just opened, so it was a very exciting time for international law students. But I quickly figured out that international law wasn't for me. I became interested in trial work after my first year. I clerked at a firm in Augusta, an insurance defense firm, Fulcher Hagler. And then after my second year, I clerked at two larger law firms, one in Charlotte, Robinson, Bradshaw, and Henson, and then Fulbright and Jaworski in Houston. And was those firms, I was able to circulate through their various departments and quickly learned I did not want to do tax law. Sorry, those of you who are interested in tax. And also spent quite a bit of time doing in the corporate group at Fulbright and Jaworski, and ultimately decided I didn't want to do that. And what sealed the deal for me was that I was honored to get a clerkship with Judge O'Kelly in the Northern District of Georgia. And after clerking on the district court, I knew that I wanted to go into litigation.
Justice Warren, how about you?
Sure, and thanks so much for having me. It really is a privilege to be with UGA today, and thank you for having two Dukies. Justice McMillan is also a dog, so she gets both, but thanks for having both of us here today. So, I don't know if this makes people feel good or feel bad, but both of my parents are attorneys by training. They both actually went to UGA for law school, and I still had no idea what I wanted to do or really what I was doing when I showed up at law school. My parents practiced law for about 5 years, and then my dad ended up switching professions, and then my mom ended up really becoming a full-time mom even after 5 years of practice. So she really kind of gave up her legal career to raise my brother and me, for which I am really, really grateful. But I went to law school and I didn't know what I was getting into. And I think I probably only had preconceived notions and stereotypes about what trial lawyers did versus what corporate lawyers did, what plaintiffs' work was, what defense work was like. And I just didn't really understand the nuts and bolts of it until I got into some later experiences, things like moot court and trial practice classes, and got a taste for litigation and became really interested in doing that. And I heard Sarah ask too, were you interested in being a judge when you went to law school? And the answer for that for me is not even in the slightest. It wasn't even something that I thought was possible. I mean, it wasn't something people talked about. I'm certainly not down on anyone who has an aspiration for being a judge. I think it's great if you know what you want to do, because then you can lay a path out and try to obtain those goals and to other experiences that will help you towards that goal. But there was nobody in my law school class, a professor or a dean, whispering in my ear like, oh, you should really be a judge. That was certainly not anything anyone talked about. And because I was from Georgia, but going to school in North Carolina, there wasn't a focus on state law really at all, because Duke wasn't focused on teaching even North Carolina law. And so it wasn't until I moved home about 5 or 6 years ago to work in the Attorney General's office, having practiced as a major litigation partner at this big DC firm. It wasn't until I came home and started looking at state law and our state constitution that I began to get really well versed in what state law looks like and how you construe state statutes and the import of state constitutions. And it wasn't until I started going through that process and really caring about how that happened, how judges were construing the Constitution, how they were interpreting state statutes, and not just resolving contract disputes and things that could turn on state law, but aren't kind of existential to the law itself. That's when I got really intrigued and started trying to think what it would look like if I applied my jurisprudence to this. And that's when I started pursuing the path to potentially becoming a judge.
What about you, Justice McMillan? When did you start thinking about your path to the bench?
Well, I was just like Justice Warren. I didn't think about becoming a judge in law school at all. And even after clerking for Judge O'Kelly, I didn't think about it because I really didn't think I would have that kind of opportunity. And so the first time I started thinking about becoming a judge was when I had a couple of Superior Court judges resign in my home circuit. I live in Fayette County now, and that was about 10 years ago that we had the judges resign. And I started worrying about our bench and about my community. And so I started thinking about applying for those positions. And to be frank with you, I had pretty much decided I wasn't going to apply because I was happy with my practice at Sutherland. And also I knew that I would have to run for election if I did get the seat, and that was something that I had never really wanted to do. So I pretty much decided not to apply, but what changed my mind were my two kids. At the time, they were I think 3 and 7. And I wanted, especially for my daughter, to be able to tell her that I was willing to take a chance and not stay comfortable in my position, and that I would do what I can to serve the community where they were going to grow up. So I put my name in, did not get the Superior Court positions, but the state court judge was elevated to Superior Court, and then Governor Perdue appointed me to the state court. And so that was my first judicial position. And so frankly, I didn't start thinking about becoming a judge until about 2 weeks before I applied to be a judge.
Well, came from a very admirable goal. Another question related to law school is, for us, UGA Law has done a really great job between connecting the theory and the rules that we learn in the classroom to hands-on experience we can get with clinical work and internships. And wanted to ask if you two, starting with Justice Warren, had participated in this kind of work while you were in law school, and whether you think students should make an effort to get this kind of hands-on experience while in school.
Sure. Well, I think that the primary thing is it's really good to do things that you're interested in, because you're more likely to work really hard at those things, and to gain experience and to do well. But I also think it's good to kind of broaden whatever your interest is. Law school is the time to branch out a little bit and to try some new things as well. And I think something that I didn't do particularly well in law school was that I was so focused on doing extracurricular activities that I think I did some of those to the exclusion of practical experiences that I could have had in the classroom. So, I was the editor-in-chief of my law journal. I did moot court. I was involved in a bunch of clubs and other activities. All of those things were important to me and they were meaningful, but it filled so much of my time that I didn't have time. When it came time to decide whether I would do a clinic, I looked at my schedule and how many hours a week I was working on journal. I said, well, I can't possibly do a clinic. And so I didn't. I did moot court and I got some of the experience from that. But I know, especially over time, as UGA and so many other schools have developed these really excellent clinics, practical skills, living communities. Those are things that really would have served me well in private practice. And they also would have helped me figure out what kind of practice I wanted, because the beauty of a clinic is you can gain the skill and you can say at the end of the clinic, this is something I would like to do in private practice, or it's not. And sometimes knowing that you don't want to do something is just as valuable as knowing what you do want to do.
Justice McMillan, how about you?
So I also didn't participate in a clinic, but I wish I did. I had many friends who did clinical work, and they really enjoyed it, found it worthwhile and rewarding, even if they ended up not doing that particular area of law. I mean, I have a similar story as Justice Warren. I had actually looked into the legal aid and public defender clinic with Professor Gabriel. I think he had just pretty much started it then. I mean, that's showing our age too. We've been around for a while. But I was concerned about the time commitment, not only because of my academic pursuits and goals, but also I'd gotten engaged. So I had a personal reason. I was planning a wedding. And so I decided not to go with the clinic, and also actually step back from law review at the same time too. And when I was younger, I had a little bit of regret about, because I always wanted to do everything and be involved with everything. But now, looking back, I recognize it's okay not to have it all, to make choices that were important for my personal well-being and my personal mental health and my personal relationships. So though I wish I had that clinical experience, I think that would have been very valuable to me in my practice and now as a judge. I'm now at peace with, not doing the clinics and because of my other personal commitments at the time.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. And both of you just touched on this a little bit in your answers, but is there anything you wish you would have known while you were in law school? Do you have any advice for current students of how to make the most of their time here in school? Justice McMillan, if you want to continue on what you just left off, that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, I would tell people that I didn't focus enough on developing and maintaining relationships that I made in law school. I knew how to be a good student from my previous experience. I knew what it it took to make good grades and, you know, to establish a good academic record. But what I didn't really understand was the importance of making connections within the legal community, and how that important that would be going forward, not only in private practice, but I mean, for me now as a Supreme Court justice, running an election statewide, which I never wanted to do either. It's been really important, and I've been grateful for the connections that I did make in the law school, because I feel like I have friends in every community, in the legal community in the state. So um, my advice for students is to not only focus on school, which of course is very important, so I can't uh, not emphasize that, but also make sure that you develop those relationships.
Justice Warren, have any sage words of wisdom?
Well, I think Justice McMillan has hit the nail on the head. Relationships are so important. And one thing that I did not understand when I was in law school that I do now is, I thought I had no time when I was in law school. I felt like I was so busy. There were never enough hours in the day. And that's not to say that that's not a real feeling. I'm sure a lot of you are going through that right now, and you feel like, how am I going to fit in my classes and my extracurriculars and my leadership activities and all the different things that you do, and still have your friends and your family and things like that. So that's real, but it doesn't really get better as you get older. You start practicing. Many of you will start billing hours. You start to have a family if that's something that you want, and it doesn't get easier. So what I wish in retrospect is that I had sort of thought a little bit more strategically about the time that I did have in law school. There are all these things now in retrospect I wish I had explored: academic subjects, different ideas that were presented in law school that I would have liked to investigate, instead of just sort of taking a professor's word that the law was supposed to be one way or the other. I probably did have time in law school to look into that and to explore and to do extra reading. It's hard to think about doing that with all the reading you guys already have. But that's the time to explore when you're with all these people who want to talk about that. Now sometimes I sit down at the dinner table with my husband, who is also a lawyer by training. But, if I want to think about some deep legal theory, he's capable of doing it, but he might just not want to talk about that at the end of the day. In law school, so many people want to engage on that. And your research assistants and your teaching assistants and your professors, they want to engage in that too. So that's really a time to enrich yourself and to explore and not just learn the rules of law. But I think what Justice McMillan said that I agree with so much is that relationships are absolutely critical. They're not just critical in the practice of law, but they're really critical in life. And I think it's something we've seen a lot in this pandemic, is that what has sustained us all through not being physically together are the people in our lives that we can call or FaceTime or Zoom. And that connection's there whether or not you get to see them in person. So many of those friends for me, I made in undergraduate, and have a couple of those friends from law school. But the more time you're able to spend into putting yourself into genuine relationships with people, not just relationships for expedient ends, and whether those relationships are with your classmates or your section mates, people in extracurriculars, or also professors, those are genuine relationships that will sustain you over decades of time. There are, of course, a lot of practical implications from that too. You never know who your opposing counsel is going to be and who you're going to be asking for an extension from. You never know who might be your boss at work, who might give you a job, who might refer you a case. But those are things that flow from genuine relationships. You don't make relationships just because of those things. But once you do have genuine relationships, I think that the fruit of that is beyond just the emotional. And there are so many important ones. That the practice of law seems like it is a big profession, but especially in a state like ours, it is very small. And so now is the time to get to know people and to really, comport yourself with a lot of dignity and grace and professionalism, even as a law student, because people will remember what you're like in law school. And, sometimes I shudder to think what my classmates would say, other than, I can't believe she's a judge.
I think they say I knew she was going to be a judge one day. But yes, I wholeheartedly agree that I think for me, the relationships I've made in law school have made it one of the best experiences I've ever had, especially at Georgia Law. But speaking on the time management front, you're both very busy as justices on the Supreme Court, and I know that you're both involved in your communities in leadership roles and different boards. And how do you successfully manage all these different responsibilities at one time, especially to make sure you're taking care of your physical and mental well-being? Justice McMillan, if you would like to start.
Yeah, I don't know how successful I am in managing my time, but I mean, one thing I tell students is that there is this myth out there that you can have it all, and I think you can have it all, but maybe not all at the same time. So I try to keep that in mind. So focus on activities where that I enjoy or have a natural interest in, and then I'm trying to be realistic about the time commitments and because any activity I want to be involved with, I want to do a really good job and maybe even take a leadership role at some point in it. And then I've found that, with that, you've got to learn that there are other things that in your life that you have to let go and that can wait. When it was, when my kids were small, I had to let some of the outside activities go because I had to spend more time with them. Now that they're teenagers, it's easier for me to uh, go on a overnight trip or to go to a meeting in the evening because they don't need me personally there. But I think it's just important to just learn to wait on those things um, that if your time doesn't permit you to commit at that time, then it's okay. Just the time will come later.
Justice Warren.
Well, unsurprisingly, I agree with what Justice McMillan said as well. I think that's a really important lesson. And we're all, sort of seeing the waxing and waning of the different things in our lives because they're just different seasons for different activities and commitments and things like that. One lesson that's been really hard for me to learn, but that has been really important is that I just can't do everything by myself. And I'm so used to being self-sufficient. And as I became a mom, especially, it was really hard for me to admit that I needed help from other people. And I mean like actual logistical help. Like, can you help me get my child to school? Would you mind picking my kid up when you're picking your kid up? I just had my third child 4 months ago. She turned 4 months today. And now more than ever, I have to accept the fact that I cannot do the job that I do on behalf of the people of Georgia and have a partner, my husband, who does the work that he does in his job and do the traveling that we do and do every single thing to make our house work. And so what that means for me is, I moved from Washington, D.C. back home to Georgia, which is something I'd always wanted to do, but to be closer to my parents. And before the pandemic, especially, they were really involved in our children's lives and helped us on a lot of logistics. For me, and I know our audience today is probably broader than just women, but there's the Women's Law Student Association in particular. For me, I had to think about what that meant for my childcare. I have to have help with childcare. And so there are people who are parts of our lives as far as childcare goes that they help me get my work done on a day-to-day basis. I am privileged to be in that position. And I know that not everybody is in that position, but I've really had to let go of the idea that, family is just mom and dad trying to succeed on a day-to-day basis. I've really embraced this idea that there's really something to the idea of having a larger family, a family and friends and trusted people who all help each other get through day to day. And that's something that I've really had to work on and I'm getting better at, I think, over time, perhaps just out of necessity.
Yes, I'm sure. I mean, we all need help. And I think that is a lovely way to put it, that I've always thought of friends as family too. So I think it is very important to, you never know when you're going to need help or when someone else is going to need your help. So I think it's very important to be in tune with those around you and to help in the ways that you can. But now that we've talked a little bit about law school, I'd like to transition some about your path to the bench and how you view judges' roles and lawyers' roles in the legal system overall. So you both talked about how you became interested in becoming a judge, but if you wanted to elaborate on that some, I'm sure the audience would welcome it. And also, did any role models or mentors play a large role in where you are in your life now and deciding to become a judge? And how would you advise students to form those relationships? Justice Warren, if you'd like to start.
Sure. Well, there's a lot there. And what I can say first is that, for me, and this is what Justice McMillan, you heard her say too, my interest in being a judge was a little bit situational. My interest in public service was something that I'd had for a very long time. And so my plan, to the extent I had one, was that I was going to go into private practice, gain a bunch of skills, get a bunch of experiences, and find ways to give back throughout, whether that was pro bono or transitioning to some kind of public service career after doing private practice. I wasn't really sure I was going to kind of go down that path and try to keep my options open and kind of do as much good as I could along the way. I had an opportunity to represent the state of Georgia in what's known as the Water Wars litigation, which is a longstanding 3 decades dispute between Georgia, Florida, and Alabama. And long story short, because I was representing the state of Georgia in private practice, I was working really closely with the then Attorney General, Sam Olens, and a bunch of different state agencies. And this was all while I was in DC. And in the course of doing that, I was coming home to Atlanta a lot. I was interviewing witnesses. I was interacting with all these folks who were part of the litigation, and they were all state government employees. And I just thought to myself, these are amazing people. I mean, these are people who get up every day and they go to work and they serve their state, and it's in all different kinds of ways. Some of them were lawyers, some of them were hydrologists, some of them were soil experts. I mean, there was everything, statisticians. And I realized that when I was in law school, as much as I loved my alma mater, they were not talking about serving your estate. They were talking about going to work for the federal government or being an AUSA or a federal public defender. They weren't encouraging people to go be state prosecutors or state, defense attorneys or public defenders or whatever it was. And it just sort of dawned on me that that was an opportunity that I really wanted. And so I gave up the partnership at my firm and came home to serve in this capacity. And that's when I started getting exposed, not just to that one water wars case, but to all kinds of appellate litigation, because I helped to manage that department. And over the years, had more and more experience working on cases where it was the state's job to figure out how to make an argument to the state Supreme Court about how a constitutional provision should be construed or how a state statute should be interpreted. And that's something I really cared about. And I did have my own jurisprudence that I had developed over a number of years. And part of it's not just how I analyze the law, but how I view judges and our 3-branch system of government. And I believed very strongly that, for example, judges aren't policymakers. They're people who construe and apply laws. We're not governors, we're not executives, we're not legislators, and we have to leave those branches to doing their own work. And it's a good talking point. You probably hear people say it because it's the same thing you learn when you're in grade school. Doing it, though, is a really different matter, because it means that when a case comes up, and you think in your heart that maybe you think a law should be construed a different way, just because you think that's a better way, not what the law actually says, your job is to stop and say, well, what does the law say? And then that's how you have to apply the law, so long as it is a constitutional and otherwise valid law. And so that happens, not infrequently, I think probably for most of us. But it's the joy of the job, because when you have that tension, and frankly, when you have that discomfort, you're doing it the right way. And there's something gratifying about that, even when you sort of think about, well, what would happen if I were in a different branch? But you try to leave those musings where they are and do your job every day.
Justice McMillan, how have your prior experiences influenced your perspective on the bench?
I think my most influential person in my life in this area was Judge O'Kelly. He was the quintessential trial court judge, in my opinion. And not only did he know the law backwards and forwards, he actually served on the bench for over 45 years. So he knew everything. But also he taught me how to conduct myself as a lawyer and as a professional, and what it meant to have character on the bench. And so I really credit Judge O'Kelly as the example that I try to follow on the bench as a judge, not only in the courtroom, but also in our local communities. Judge O'Kelly was very much involved in his local community, and community service has always been important to me, even before I became a judge. I never thought about public service, but I was very much involved in community service. So it was a very natural transition for me, thinking about becoming a judge, because, as I mentioned, it was born out of a interest to serve the community where my kids are going to be growing up. So you also asked a question about judicial philosophy, and Judge O'Kelly again was a great example and educator for me on judicial philosophy. I mean, I believe wholeheartedly that the judicial branch, and as the other branches of government, has its own authority and its own responsibilities, and that are and I believe strongly in the separation of powers. And it's important for us as judges to remember that, because there's no real direct check on our power. I mean, um, especially now that I'm on the Georgia Supreme Court. I mean, it's very rare when the US Supreme Court is going to reach out and say that we've done something wrong. So what we say becomes a law in Georgia, and it's generally without much review. And so I think it's important for us on the court to remember that we are the judicial branch, and that our role is to review the actions of the other two branches of government, and that it was important to restrain ourselves and not reach out and try to create policy or um, enforce actions. That's just not our role. And so I believe strongly that judges should abide by the rule of law, and especially with statutory and constitutional texts, to ascribe the meaning that is in the text of the statute. Because otherwise, if there's no other restraint on how to read that text, if it's just based on what the judge thinks the law should be, then that really is no restraint at all. So I believe strongly in looking at the meaning of the text of the statutes and the Constitution as it was meant to be at the time that it was written.
Well, similarly to the role of judges, I think lawyers also have a particular role to play in society. And I'm going to read now to make sure I get the words correct. But the State Bar of Georgia has a wonderful creed and aspirational statement. And there's one line that I particularly like. Quote, to the public and our systems of justice, I offer service. I will strive to improve the law in our legal system, to make the law in our legal system available to all, and to seek the common good throughout the representation of my clients, end quote. Throughout this past year, our country has faced a lot with the pandemic and a contentious election. And as law students and future lawyers to be, how do we push through all of this noise in the unending news cycle and the polarization of our political communities of late to uphold the justice system? Justice Warren, if you'd like to begin.
Sure, Sarah. Well, I mean, look, I think that sometimes we forget, and I'm using the royal we because I've been in this position. We forget that when we start law school, that's really the start of our legal careers. We may not be under the jurisdiction of a state bar or the disciplinary authority of a Supreme Court, but it starts as soon as we step foot on campus and we start taking those classes. And so we have to start being the professionals that lawyers are supposed to be from that very first day. And, we could probably talk about all kinds of, big picture topics, but I think what this really boils down to is, as a person and as a person who is becoming a lawyer, you should be kind, you should be respectful, you should be willing to learn, which means you should be willing to be wrong. And by making professionalism a paramount goal of your time in law school, and then as a lawyer, once you're barred and you're practicing, out in the public, you will then be that pillar of the community that lawyers have always been. I mean, when we think about what lawyers were decades and decades ago, they weren't just people who argued, and they weren't people who argued on TV or in classrooms. They were people who were paragons of virtue in their communities. They were the people that everyone looked to and relied upon to make things right, or to give people representation, or to have a voice be heard, or to do those tough things that needed to be done in communities. And so when you go back to what we were at our inception, I think it really gives us a new focus on how we are supposed to be going forward. And that's something that I really hope we don't lose sight of. Justice McMillan will probably tell you that both of us have been involved in our Chief Justice's Commission on Professionalism. And that is a body that is dedicated to talking about professionalism in the practice. But just because they're talking about it in the practice for people who've already taken the bar and who are out in the world practicing doesn't mean it doesn't apply, at least in spirit, to all of you who are watching and developing your careers over these 3 years. So I don't just encourage you, I actually implore you to really think about these things and to implement them in your day-to-day life.
Justice McMillan, I know this is very important to you as well, so I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, thanks. And I absolutely agree with Justice Warren, and I think law students and the public lose sight of the fact, or maybe they just don't know that we as lawyers, we are practicing in a noble profession. We're not just making widgets or providing a trade service. This is a profession. And so the Chief Justice Commission on Professionalism, which I've been involved with for a number of years, it's the first organization of its kind in the country to promote and enhance the professionalism of Georgia lawyers. That's all it does. And Sarah, the statement that you read is part of the Lawyers Creed, an aspirational statement, and these are goals that we encourage Georgia lawyers to follow as they are practicing law. I mean, the public has a view of lawyers as being contentious or aggressive and often unscrupulous. And I think movies like The Paper Chase promote that also within the law school community. But that's not how I see lawyers acting as professionals. Um, that the statement that you read is part of the larger statement, which summarizes what we think, what the Supreme Court thinks are important for lawyers as professionals. And I like to summarize them as the 4 C's. So lawyers need to be competent, they need to have character, they need to be civil, and they need to have a commitment to the public good and to furthering the good of the community. And so we as lawyers can agree that these are worthy goals, and I think they're worthy goals for law students as well. And in these troubled times, I think that these tools of professionalism can help us as lawyers and just members of the community have discourse with others who may have divergent views. I mean, obviously lawyers have very divergent views even within our own community, but we can have that discourse, keeping in mind these 4 C's so that we can speak out competently with knowledge and based on our experience, speak truthfully. That goes to your character with basis in the facts. We can be civil, we can disagree without being disagreeable, and then we can commit ourselves to the public good and at all times uphold the rule of law and our Constitution. So I think that it's important that law students realize that they are stepping into this history of a noble profession, and that there are tools that we can use as just members of our community as lawyers to promote the public good.
Yes. Well, thank you so much. I agree. And I'm really glad that we have such a large audience of law students to hear that today. On a more fun question, what do you find is the most rewarding part of being a justice, and perhaps not so fun, the most challenging part? Justice McMillan.
Well, I think the most rewarding part of being a justice is being able to develop the law here in the state in such a way that others can follow, and that there's hopefully a clear path that they need to follow in order to abide by the rule of law in our state, and to be able to participate in that. as part of that process, I found one of the most rewarding experiences has been working with the other justices on our court in order to come to, those conclusions. We're a very collaborative and collegial court. So even though we may have disagreements on what the law is, that's always done in a professional and civil manner, and it's been a pleasure to work with the justices in crafting these opinions. As far as challenges, I think that's also one of the biggest challenges is making sure that we get it right. We want to get the law right. We want to explain it in such a way that people can understand and follow and conduct themselves accordingly.
Justice Warren, how about you?
Sure. Well, for me, I think one of the most rewarding things about being in this position is getting to know people across the state. I grew up in Atlanta, and so I have a strong base of family and friends here, and I've traveled around the state. But when you are a statewide elected official, and we also in non-pandemic times get to travel around and hold oral argument in different places across the state, it's wonderful to meet people who are practicing in front of you and who will never have an opportunity to see you otherwise, but also people who aren't lawyers, and to educate them about our court and about what we do and about our important but limited role as judges. So I love that personable aspect of things, which also is true, I think, with respect to the 9 justices. Just like Justice McMillan said, it is really rewarding and fun and perhaps personally edifying to be able to be a law nerd all day long, in a relatively judgment-free zone. Not entirely. We do rib each other occasionally, but I learned so much from my colleagues every day, and that is not any kind of exaggeration. We all have different experiences, different backgrounds. We're from different parts of the state. We've had different background experiences as far as professional experiences or different kinds of courts that we've been on. So there is not a day that goes by that I don't learn something from my colleagues, which means that whether we're agreeing or we're disagreeing, I am becoming a better scholar, a better judge, a better person because of that experience. And Justice McMillan's exactly right that we are incredibly collegial and collaborative, even in our disagreements. And I hope that will set an example for others across the state of how it's possible to disagree and still get an important job done. And the challenging part of the job is that it's just a really hard job. And, what I try to remind myself of is that, at least in my view, there's no routine case. Because if you're coming before the state Supreme Court, your case is anything but routine to you. Whether your liberty is on the line, whether your business, you have a concern about your business, whether it's some kind of legal question that's existential to your family or your business or your life, these cases are really important cases to everyone who's coming before us. And so I try to make sure to remember that so that I treat each case with the respect that it deserves. The law is going to come down one way or the other. And so someone's going to win and someone's going to lose, or multiple people are going to win and lose in every case. And we try to make sure that we're as clear as possible in doing that. But gosh, it is sometimes just so hard to untangle those legal knots. And we try to do it in a way that people really understand, so that even in tough cases, the way that we explain the law is a way that is accessible to people who don't even have a legal education.
Right. Well, just to the audience, I want to give you guys a heads up of sorts that if you'd like to ask questions, we're going to open that up to the audience in a little bit. But if you could please put them in the chat, and then I will read the questions on behalf of the audience to our distinguished guests. And before we turn to questioning, we just have one last topic we'd like to briefly cover, even though this has been interwoven throughout our discussion today, and that is women in the legal profession. Until recently, you two were the only women on the Georgia Supreme Court, but Governor Kemp recently appointed Justice Sean Ellen LaGrua, and it's very exciting for me, and I'm sure many of my classmates, to see more women on our state's highest court. How do you think that diversity, and not just gender diversity, but racial and socioeconomic, helps the public view the judiciary as the trustworthy and independent institution that it is? Justice McMillan, would you like to begin?
Sure. I think it's very important. Diversity is very important within our justice system. Research has shown that if the public sees that the justice system reflects the local community, whether it's racial or gender or socioeconomic, that they have more confidence in the system. And frankly, I mean, that's what upholds our justice system. It's based on the fact that people will follow what we say. I mean, if people decide they're not going to follow what we say, then where we're going to be. So I think that's very important. And I think our justice system, we have we can always continue working on this, but I have seen, even in the course of my career, how the numbers have changed, especially for women in our profession. And I'd like to share some of that with you, because when I started in law school, even though at that time women made up about half of the class, and maybe even a little bit more than half the class in law school, you still didn't see a lot of women who were making partner at the law firms or becoming judges or general counsels. And these numbers have been improving slowly but surely over time. The first woman to serve on the Georgia Court of Appeals was in 1984, Judge Dorothy Beasley. I mean, that was not that long ago, even though I'm sure it was probably before many of you were born, but still not that long ago. But the Supreme Court, we didn't have our first woman justice until 1992 with Justice Leah Ward Sears, and she became our first woman to serve as Chief Justice in 2005. So that's still pretty relatively recent history. But I'm proud now that with the addition of Justice LaGrua to our bench, we're 1/3 women, and the Court of Appeals has the same percentage of women as well. And I looked up the percentages in the lower courts in Georgia, and they're a little bit better than 1/3. So we're getting there, even though it doesn't match the population. I am encouraged that women have been able to ascend to the highest levels of our profession, and that I've been able to witness that.
Me too. Justice Warren, how do you think that this role is important in the judiciary? And looking back at your career, have you seen the role of women in the legal profession change over time?
Well, yes, Sarah. I think I've had a lot of the same observations that Justice McMillan has over time, and things are always improving. But even looking sort of in the realm of law firms, I think that law firms are making big strides in trying to pay more attention to making sure that women have the resources they need to be able to get to the places they want to go, and if they want to be a partner, to be able to rise to that level. I will say in the judiciary, I do think diversity is important, and a primary reason that it is because I do think it is so important that when someone walks into a courtroom, whether that person is the lawyer who's trying the case or defending the case, the person who is on trial, the person whose family dispute or contract dispute or business dispute is a subject of that court case, or a juror, if you walk into that courtroom, there is a chance that you at least see somebody behind the bench that looks like you or is from your community or that represents you. That does create trust. And I think that overall representation is a really important part of the judicial system. But at the same time, I will say being a woman doesn't change how I view the law. That's being a woman is not a judicial philosophy, or at least it isn't for me. And so when I'm deciding how to analyze the law, I use the same rubric that I always use for all legal problems. With that said, being a woman does change my interpersonal interactions. And I think one of the primary ways that happens is that when I'm having an interaction with one of my 8 colleagues, I bring certain things to the table because I grew up in Atlanta, because I'm a woman, because I'm a mom, because of all the different experiences that I've had. And I think that all my colleagues bring those experiences to the table too. And again, those things don't dictate how we view the law, but they certainly contribute to the kinds of conversations that we have with each other, the kind of information that we're able to bring to bear to our interactions, and also with our interactions with the public. And so having that kind of diversity, not racial diversity is of course important, gender diversity is of course important, but there's so many other kinds, especially on a statewide body, geographic diversity, so that when people come before us, they understand that the justices aren't all a bunch of people from Atlanta, that there are people from every corner of our state. The diversity in the background that we have, making sure that we have trial judges and state court judges and court of appeals judges, in addition to people who have had experience in private practice or in other experiences. Those are all things that contribute, I think, to our efficacy as a court, but also the trust that people will have in us.
Well, thank you both for being both so open and candid. We really appreciate it. And now, so that we have enough time left, I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience. So the first one we have is, what do you each foresee as some of the biggest challenges for students starting their legal studies and or entering the legal profession at this time in history. Justice McMillan, if you would like to start us off.
Well, I think the biggest challenge right now is overcoming COVID and the pandemic. And I think law firms are going to be pivoting even after the pandemic is over and after the social distancing is no longer required. I mean, we've learned on this court how to work from home and how to be flexible. And I think law firms have have experienced that as well. And so they're going to have to figure out, how to incorporate that into the practice of law. And so I think it's an exciting time for students and a challenging time as well for students as they're coming in to the profession. I mean, for those who are starting their careers right now in the middle of the pandemic, I just encourage you to hang in there. At some point, you will get to meet your colleagues and go to court. I promise you. But yeah, all joking aside, I think that is going to be the main challenge in the next few years, just trying to incorporate all this new technology and that the courts and also the firms are using in terms of working from home and meeting clients from home, but also we're going to still have to have we're going to have in-person trials and other proceedings. So how to balance that and still practice law.
Justice Warren, would you like to add anything?
Sure. I mean, I'm a little bit removed from being a 3L. I'm mostly thankful for that. But, I would imagine that the thing that is on many students' minds is just getting a job in the first place, right? I mean, it's a little bit of a tough time to get a job. But I think hanging in there is good advice because things are going to change at some point. It's a slow and steady race, and I don't know when things will change. But I think one thing to keep an eye out for is as you're looking for that job, you don't have to find a perfect job the first time, right? Every job is a really important experience to gaining skills and building relationships. But given the climate and given where we are and probably the likelihood that you've not been able to have all the same kinds of in-person internships that you normally would have had or externships or things like that, I think it's all the more reason to actually look around at what you do have at your UGA law school environment, your classmates and your professors, and invest in those people now, because it very well may be the case that the best person to talk to your future employer about the kind of work that you're capable of doing is the professor that you worked for or wrote a really great exam for, or your study partner might be the person who comes across a job that they think is perfect for you and recommends you for it. I mean, these are times to look at the resources you do have, and maybe some of those resources are external to the law school too, people in your community that you can form relationships with, but don't wait to start doing those things because we do have challenges ahead, and they're challenges that I think we can all meet as a society, as in a profession, but do the things that you can do. We only have control over a little corner of the world right now, but you can try to control those things you can control, and then those things that we can't control, we'll try to be patient and let those things get resolved.
I know you both are very busy, so we don't want to keep you too much longer today. I just want to say thank you both so much for speaking with us and sharing your experiences with us here today. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank everyone who helped bring this Edith House Lecture today together: Dean Rutledge, Laura Pulliam, Heidi Murphy, Jim Henneberger, who is the technical mastermind behind all of this, and Jamie Blevins, who is Justice McMillan's assistant, who is very helpful in coordinating this event. And I also want to especially thank the Edith House Lecture sponsor, Edith House and her wonderful family, the Bentons, who help us provide wonderful speakers each year to the UGA law community. We hope you enjoyed hearing from our distinguished guests, Justice McMillan and Warren of the Georgia Supreme Court. And thank you both again so much for your time and your openness. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
And thanks for having me. It's always great being back at the law school, even virtually.
Even virtually. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. And that concludes our 38th Edith House Lecture.
Thank you.